Going to bring in Abigail R. Blanco. She is a research fellow for the Independent Institute. Abigail, thank you so much for joining us here on News Now. We appreciate you being here with us. You actually wrote a blog about this, and I want to read just a part of it really quickly. You say the conviction is being called historic. Although we can expect the outcome to be appealed, the fact that Chauvin was tried, much less convicted, is noteworthy. I'm excited about this conversation. So let's just get started. Let's talk about statistics in things like this even happening. Police officers getting convicted and eventually being found guilty. How common is that?
So the short answer is that it's not particularly common at all. So those of us who research in issues related to policing face a number of obstacles in conducting that research. When it comes to looking at police-related fatalities, one of the primary challenges is that we actually don't have complete data. There, as of 2021, is no official comprehensive database that looks at police shootings. And so we have to rely on a number of different third parties who do the best that they can, but we recognize that that data is not necessarily as good as we would want it to be. What we do know is that police kill, on average, in the United States, about 1,000 people every year, and that very, very few of those incidents lead to criminal charges for police officers or convictions, even if those cases are brought to trial.
Yeah, and I find that so interesting. You know, this is one of the first cases that has really come to the public eye, though, because of all the evidence that was surrounding it. I'm curious, do you think that this case is going to change police being held accountable for their actions, even if there isn't video that has been taken, pretty blatantly obvious video on the scene there?
So I think that that's an interesting question, and people have brought forth that exact question, this idea that will this case be the genesis, if you will, of greater police accountability? And I think that there are a few different reasons that even though this is a step in the right direction, it is likely not going to herald in some new era of police accountability, at least not right away. And there are a few different issues that are important when having this discussion. So things like police leeway on the use of force, the implications surrounding police unions, as well as things like perceived imminent threat, and then also, quite importantly, the doctrine of qualified immunity, which is something that has gained a lot of traction in the last few years.
And you also wrote a little bit in your blog, your excerpt that you wrote, that typically a lot of these cases that do come forth are talking about self-defense cases where there's a real threat. And so this was an interesting case in that it wasn't necessarily like any of that. How did the statistics reflect in comparison to a self-defense case versus a non-self-defense case where there's no threat? How does that look like as far as statistics go, the numbers?
So that's a really good question, and we don't have, again, all of the data related to different types of cases. There are certain databases that we can look through, and we can sift through different details related to different cases. But often what we see is that cases that have like a plausible self-defense component, so you have what's called a perceived imminent threat, where it would appear that most people would agree that a threat was real, those cases, frankly, aren't brought to trial in the first place. But what we do know is that of the cases that are brought to trial, most of them do result in either an acquittal, or when convictions do occur, it's for a lesser charge. So if we look, for instance, I believe it's from 2005 forward, we have about 110 cases of police officers who were charged with either murder or manslaughter related to a police shooting. And most of those resulted in an acquittal. And then about 40 of those, 43 I think, resulted in some kind of a conviction, but it was often for a lesser charge.
And you wrote something about qualified immunity. Can you explain that to everyone who's listening in right now, what that means specifically in the case of police officers?
So when we talk about qualified immunity, this is a legal doctrine that was created by the U.S. Supreme Court, and it's intended to try to shield government officials from essentially frivolous lawsuits. Because you don't want, or you wouldn't want, a scenario where, say, somebody could sue a police officer for something just silly that occurred in the course of the police officer doing their job. So what qualified immunity effectively does is that it requires that in order for a government official, in this case police officers, to be held legally liable, plaintiffs have to show, so the victims of police violence in this particular context, they have to show that a clearly established constitutional or statutory right was violated, and they have to find a case with functionally equivalent facts. So they basically have to find a case that looks almost exactly like the one that they're attempting to bring to court. This sets a remarkably high bar for people who want to try to seek damages or other types of accountability for police officers. It creates a really, really high bar to the point where people both sides of the political aisles, Democrats, Republicans, have called pretty loudly for reform or even abolition of qualified immunity in some cases. So you see Supreme Court justices, again, who would be considered politically misaligned. So you see Justice Sotomayor, you see Clarence Thomas, and others calling for changes to this particular legal doctrine.
Did we see any of that in this case, this Derek Chauvin trial, qualified immunity? Was that brought up?
So when we look at qualified immunity, this is oftentimes invoked in a variety of different police cases. And so certainly when you are looking at cases like the Chauvin trial, when you are looking at any cases typically involving police misconduct, it is something that is frequently discussed, whether it's ultimately employed or not employed.
What do you see as the future for keeping police accountable across the country here? Just in the past week, the past couple of days, we have seen more situations, more shootings, and kind of circling back to our other conversation, how technology has really changed the game as far as evidence goes. I'm curious what you see as the future.
I think that there are a number of different potential avenues that we might see moving forward. I do think that addressing qualified immunity could be a very potentially important way that we might start to see more police accountability. I think revisiting what is put into union contracts, for instance, for police officers. So we see things like misconduct being expunged from records of former police officers as part of union negotiated contracts. You also see that police officers can do things like exchange in their sick days in some cases when they are suspended. And so I think that looking at those types of issues is one path forward, and the Fraternal Order of Police has said that they are open to making those various types of reforms and that they don't want to protect bad police officers from bad behavior. But related to my own research more specifically, I think looking at and starting to address some of the core issues for why it is that we see police behaving so aggressively within the United States. So talking about things like the integration of military hardware, military tactics, and so on into domestic policing, where this was not the case, say, in the 1960s or even the 1970s.
Yeah, it's so interesting to see generationally how things have changed. And even just in the past year, 2020, 2021, things are really being brought specifically to the public eye as well. So we appreciate you breaking it all down for us. Anything else to be noting with all of this going on across the country?
I would say that just this pattern that we are seeing, even though it is, and as you mentioned, social media and technology has put this issue really front and center. But one of the things that I would point out is that this is a trend that has been going on for quite a while. So you look at 2015 to 2019, 2020, it's about still 1,000 people every year who are killed by police. And even if you think of those killings as being justified, and in some cases, whether they're tried or not, it appears that those incidents might be justified. But I think we can have a serious conversation as to why those numbers are what they are, and then what might be some ways that we can reduce those numbers. Because I think that when you talk to police, they don't like those statistics either. And so regardless of how we ultimately feel about policing in this country, we can all agree that we would like for those numbers to be lower than what they are.
And that's such a great point. There's two sides to this narrative. There's obviously the police side, and we keep hearing, there's some bad apples out there, but a lot of them are good. So there's a lot of police unions that are frustrated right now with the way that they are being painted, because they say that they want to be out there and helping the community, patrolling the community in the right way. So I appreciate you bringing that up. We want to bring up both sides of this conversation.
Absolutely.
All right, Abigail Blanco, thank you so much for joining us here on News Now from Fox. Hopefully we get to speak to you again.
Anytime. Thank you for having me.